The life and work of Ray Bradbury. Family and early childhood. Ray Bradbury was born on August 22, 1920. He was raised in a small Illinois town and was born in the average family. His father, who worked in utilities, and his mother, who had immigrated from Sweden. Growing up in the early 20th century didn't mean there was any lack of media. A young Ray would enjoy early science fiction stories and horror films like Phantom of the Opera. It would also seem at this period of his life he started to write. He started writing in his early teens, and it seems as though he would write every day in the future. After high school, he couldn't afford college, so instead he went to the library, later saying how he'd study at the library 3 times a week for 10 years. Throughout his whole adult life, he was devoted to his writing, publishing his first story the same year he had graduated high school. Historical context. Ray Bradbury was a prolific writer throughout the mid and late 20th century, and throughout much of his writing career was the threat of the USSR and the spread of communism. The Red Scare wasn't the only thing Ray Bradbury focused his writings on. In the 20th century, the rise of consumerism to the point of waste led to his inspiration for books like Fahrenheit 451. His writing career. Ray Bradbury was a prolific writer throughout his whole life, so it's safe to assume that his writing career was a lengthy and busy one. Bradbury was most known for his novels, however the majority of his writings were in short stories and other non-novel related works. By the end of his life, the late Ray Bradbury had over 400 works published under his name, from screenplays to poems. Major works. The majority of his works being set in the sci-fi genre had Bradbury looking ahead rather than looking back. One of the most praised pieces of visual media Bradbury has ever worked on was Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone, which was praised at the time for its groundbreaking storytelling and still lives on in modern media as common traits every director and writer would know, all from the pen of Bradbury. His most famous novel, Fahrenheit 451, has been taught and praised for decades, not just for its expertly crafted writing, as well as a cautionary tale for the future. Elderly life and death. Ray Bradbury passed away on June 5, 2012. In 2007, nearing the end of his life, he had received the coveted Pulitzer Prize Award for his 70-plus years of his groundbreaking writing career. And in his old age in Hollywood, far from his hometown in Illinois, he would often talk to his children and grandchildren about being a writer in an ever-changing world and somehow making it. His last words being, "To wake up one day and realizing that I'm on the shelves with L. Frank Baum on one end, and the other being Edgar Rice Burroughs, and down below, June Verne and H.G. Wells. That's it, huh? Everything I did was pure love. And if you live by that way, you've had a great life." Interesting facts. Throughout the 1950s, Bradbury, unbeknownst to him, was under investigation by the FBI as a suspected communist sympathizer. Bradbury began to write after speaking with a traveling carnival and learning to live forever through his writings. My first book was The Martian Chronicles. It was a collection of stories of humans through the colonization of Mars. Major characters and figures. The first major character is Yayla, the wife of Mr. K, who was a premonition of humanity's first contact. Then there's Jeff Spender, an archaeologist from the 4th Expedition who in his efforts to keep Mars free of human destruction, whether through the government or business alike, goes mad and murders several members of his expeditionary party before being killed himself by the captain. Then we have Captain Wilder, the captain of the 4th Expedition and killer of Spender. Wilder, in some aspects, does agree with Spender on views on preserving Mars, however, shortly after he leaves to explore further planets in the solar system. Next we have the minor characters. First we have Cherokee, a member of the 4th Expedition who sympathizes with Spender's points to an extent, but more than that his Native American origin helps shows the connection between the Earthlings and the Martians to the Europeans and the Native Americans. Then we have Dad and Timothy. Though only the son being referred to as by name, the dad makes a point that they are Martians now, and they will be the future of humanity. Next we have the more detailed summary of the plot. These stories begin by telling how mass rocket travel has begun on Earth to other planets. Then the story is taken away from Earth to Mr. and Mrs. K, a Martian couple. Mrs. K has a vision that aliens landing on the planet saying they're from Earth. Her husband, being very wary after hearing all of these visions, goes out and shoots the crew members of the rocket the day it lands. On the 2nd expedition, the crew is thought to be insane and are taken to an insane asylum. The psychiatrist who admits them follows the crew to a ship and continues not to believe them. He shoots the men, and as they do not disappear, he believes he is psychotic and proceeds to shoot himself. A year later, as the third rocket lands, the crew members find themselves in an ideal American town, populated entirely by lost people, all in some way related to the crew members. However, these people are really Martian shapeshifters. The crewmates were not suspicious and unaware of those among them were imposters, because they had come to the conclusion that other life forms happened to have similar thought processes. Oblivious to this, the astronauts go their separate ways to have dinner with their dead family members, the night the crewmates are murdered by the imposters. A year after the launches of the first expedition, Martians have died of chickenpox transmitted by humans previously. Captain Wilder chooses to let his men celebrate and drink. However, the crew's archaeologist is disgusted by this and the disrespect to the Martian civilization. He later goes insane and kills crew members before being shot by the captain. As the years go on, more civilization begins to pop up, with an almost boomtown-like explosion of American stylized cities popping up all over the Martian surface. News of the atomic wars reaches Mars with a message to come home, almost all leaving and returning to Earth. After 30 years since humanity made its first way to Mars, Earth is an atomic wasteland, and her family arrives to Mars to rebuild once again. Style. When reading the Martian Chronicles, it can be easy to be overwhelmed with plot details and not notice the literary devices that are used to help drive the story. For example, Sam Parkhill, the businessman who wants to use Mars for financial gain and conquer it like Earth, is a foil to Jeff Spender, the archaeologist who wants to preserve Mars in its current state and study the ancient Martians who once roamed the planet. Or the irony on the third expedition, where the readers are aware of the shapeshift Martians, where the crew members are oblivious. My personal opinions on the work. In the beginning of reading this novel, I was very much on the edge of loving it or hating it. However, after being pushed myself to continue reading the different stories, I began to recognize its charm. I would recommend this book, but only to those who are avid fans of science fiction, as well as those who are open to a story being told through a collection of stories, rather than following one linear path. My next book was Dandelion Wine, a story based loosely off Bradbury's own life and growing up in Middle America in the early 1900s. Major characters and figures. Douglas, for most of the novel, is the centerpiece of our attention, a young 12-year-old boy who is likely a representation of Bradbury at that age. We often see through his own eyes and with the magic of boyhood. Grandfather, of course, being the grandfather of Douglas, he is one who bottles the dandelion wine, and with his own childlike wonder and view of the world around him, he's able to have a strong relationship with his grandchildren at even such an old age. Minor characters. Colonel Freeley is an old resident of Greentown who is often referred to as the Time Machine by the children, for the stories he tells of being a Civil War veteran. His death also forces Douglas to take a new view on life more seriously, that there is no life without death, not just with the stories of Colonel Freeley gone, but with his life as well. Next is Bill Forrester, a man in the world with still much to learn in life. He is one to accept innovation, but is reminded by grandfather of the beauty of taking things slow. His love with an old woman who passes shortly after beginning to really truly understand each other helps Douglas in his worries of death, because though she is dead, her memory still lives on in Bill's mind. A more detailed summary of the plot. The story is told from a third-person narrator as we follow Douglas, a 12-year-old boy who is excited for summer to start. As we begin with him on the first day of summer, 1928. While out picking grapes with his brother and father, Douglas has a realization of his own life, that he really is real. The name of the book, coming from the summer ritual done yearly with his grandfather, where every day of the season they cap off a bottle of dandelion wine and save it for the winter cold to think back to the warmth. But of course for this young boy, chief among the rituals is putting up the rope swing for the gathering place of him and his friends. Later on, we see another important family ritual of beating the rugs out. And through doing this, Douglas feels closer with his family, even with just the memories of these pieces of cloth and what they have gone through. We learn of an old man, Colonel Freeley, an old Civil War veteran who often tells stories and his experiences to the children, and is thus referred to as Time Machine. However, after his death, Douglas begins to struggle with the idea of loss and loss of life, and the stories that have left with the Colonel. And his next great loss was that of his own great-grandmother, who even reassured him that no one ever died that had a family, and at that time Douglas just didn't understand this. On the hottest day of summer, Douglas comes down with a high fever, and because of the nature of the times, he too came face to face with his own mortality. He was able to make it through his sickness with a new view of life and how to live it. And at the end of the story, much like the beginning, Douglas begins to realize that summer is now drawing to an end, and takes down the ropes ring and gets ready for what's to come tomorrow. Style. Time and time again, Ray Bradbury uses the motif of death and losses that come along with it, from Douglas's closest friend moving to his own great-grandmother passing away. And of course the theme of enjoying life, not through commodities and ease, but through family and enjoyment of the mundane, from spending time with friends around the ropes ring to mowing the lawn and savoring those still moments in life. My personal opinions on the work. I must say, compared to Martian Chronicles, I very much enjoyed this book, even from the beginning. I fell in love with the characters and the story each one of them told, as well as the message the work was trying to tell about life and eventual death. I would absolutely recommend this book, because I'm sure due to the pandemic, we've all experienced loss in some way or another. I know that most definitely I have, in numerous ways, and this book helped me realize that though the loss may be inevitable, it's never too late to begin enjoying life to its fullest. Similarities. Of course, with any Ray Bradbury piece, you can never get too far from his roots as a poet and short story author. And from his always rhyming stories, perhaps not in dictation, but the messages and themes they portray, even in Dandelion's case, starting off with a poem of its own. Of course, the latter piece being similar to Ray Bradbury's life, it's obvious to the fact that it was written in some way as an autobiography. The Martian Chronicles, however, shows the wonder he held of the world around him even at a young age, and shows how he felt as a beginning author to how the astronauts felt after meeting the Martians. Differences. The differences in these pieces were vast and quite surprising, as The Martian Chronicles is a story you much expect from an often strictly science fiction author, rather than a coming-to-age story about a boy and his own mortality. From not only the ways of storytelling, but from a collection of short stories to a more traditional linear pathway. Historical context. With The Martian Chronicles being written in 1950, 8 years before even NASA was established, you see the heavy use of popular culture to describe the space travel, as well as the Martian planet. From the shining reflective rockets to the almost atomic-like power of the rocket launch, this book gives you a good look into science fiction genre as a whole at the time. The Martian Chronicles, when first released, received high praise and helped Ray Bradbury gather a larger audience other than strictly science fiction fans, whereas Dandelion Wine, while being set in the late 1920s, while still being almost a century ago, Bradbury was still able to give the story a small, quaint town feeling that we all have experienced at one point or another. Purpose. Ray Bradbury was a very prolific writer throughout his whole life. In this, he managed to tell many stories. It seems in every single one of them, whether they be long novels or just a collection of short stories, he managed to give them all a message. Whether that message be of humanity's nature of destruction and rebuilding, or how life can often seem unfair, there's always plenty to enjoy. Bradbury's goal in his stories is to have the reader leaving and having them think about the message that he had put in his stories. My opinions on the author. Ray Bradbury's works are definitely something of an interest, not just in the science fiction genre, from the wild outer space stories and dystopian societies to the small city streets and traveling fairs, there's always something to enjoy. I'd recommend Ray Bradbury as an author not simply just as a science fiction author, but one who can make an interesting and engaging story in any scenario. But I think anyone teenage and up would really get the real meanings from his story as well as enjoy them. I believe that he should be referred to as a great author, not just as a massive compilation of his published work, but also the amount he's contributed to popular culture of not just America, but literature in general. For one describing sentence of Ray Bradbury, I say, from the stars to the streets of middle America, no place was left untouched by the creative mind of Ray Bradbury. And these are my sources.